Okay, in the previous two slides, what we have discussed is what were the reasons of resentment amongst the Indians, okay, and how they felt discontented about whatever was going on, okay, and this resentment basically was almost on the verge of catching a fire. I'm sorry, okay. So this resentment was piling up because of imposed taxes, of illegal duties and custom duties that were imposed, just because the Britishers needed money and resources to fight out the World War. So in spite of not being a part of a war that was being fought at the World War level, still India had to pay a huge price in terms of the forced recruitments that happened, and in terms of the heavy or hefty sum that they had to pay for buying essential commodities. So it was already, India now needed a political struggle, okay, against the Britishers. And in the past, India had failed. India had failed because India was not united, and the Britishers were easily able to crush. And it's not only in the past of 1857, it's also whenever there was an uprising, somehow it was crushed, okay. Whenever Indians started to unite against a common cause, it was basically limited to a small region. As I said, India was divided into very small regions, cultures, princely states, okay. So everyone had their own agenda, okay. So they always failed to unite for a common cause. So it was very easy for the central rule of the British Empire to crush any of these small uprisings that used to happen. So now the situation had come when the resentment had grown beyond bounds, okay, and there was a huge dissatisfaction or discontent amongst the Indians. So now what has happened is that there needs to happen something new, okay. So they needed a new leader who could give them a new direction and who could give them the result as well, okay. Now the Indians had come to a point wherein a new leader with a new role model to fight out the Britishers was required, okay, and that's when Gandhi emerged, okay. So Satyagraha. Now what do we mean by Satyagraha? Satyagraha is the principle of Gandhi, okay. Now Satya means obviously truth, and Agraha, okay. Agraha means in Hindi, Agraha means that how do you acknowledge the truth, okay. So Satya and Agraha, to hold the truth, to know the truth, okay. So what Satyagraha basically means is something that we will understand, but Gandhi was basically based in South Africa for a long time. He was a lawyer out there, and South Africa at that point of time was dominated by racism, okay. So just as in India we had the impacts of caste and linguistic differences, in South Africa the difference was due to color. So either people were black or they were considered as white, and there was always a racial discrimination for the blacks, okay. So Gandhi himself was a victim of racism, so he actually fought for this cause in South Africa, and his fight is well known out there. It became very famous out there, and he also became very famous out there. So his experiment for Satyagraha started in South Africa, and since that experiment was successful, he thought that why not do the same experiment with India and with the Indians, because they need it the most. I am fighting in a country which is not mine. I am fighting for the right cause, however, maybe in the wrong country. So he came back to India, okay, and he came back to India in 1915, and he said, if Satyagraha in a foreign country can actually be successful, it should be successful in India as well. And that's when the movement started. So he came back to India in 1915. His fight for Indians in South Africa was quite well known. So basically his experiment was successful. His experiment with Satyagraha was successful, and it became well known as well. So now he is a renowned figure, and he comes back to India, okay. Now Indians, as you said, and as we have discussed, Indians were discontented and they need a new leader. Now they don't want to face a failure. They want a way out, okay, because they have come to a point wherein the discontent and the dissatisfaction had crossed the limits, okay. Now they needed a new leader. Now they needed a new direction, and now they needed a new role model to fight out the British, okay. And that's when Gandhi emerged. He came back to India in 1915, and he started participating, and he started promoting his idea of Satyagraha in order to attain complete freedom from the Britishers. Okay. Now, what does the word Satyagraha mean, or what is the idea behind it? The idea of Satyagraha emphasizes the power of truth and the need to search for truth. Okay. Satya means truth. So, the power of truth and the need to search for truth. Okay. Now, what goes beyond the meaning of the word is, what he is trying to say is that definitely there is a struggle, definitely there is misery, and who is the cause of the misery? The Britishers. Okay. We need to fight out the Britishers and we need to gain complete independence from them. However, this fight against the oppressor, that is the Britishers, shouldn't be violent. What he is saying is that this fight should be non-violent. An eye for an eye, that's what he used to say, an eye for an eye will actually make the whole world blind. So, what his logic is that we have to fight it out in such a way that it appeals to the conscience of the oppressor. It actually makes them so guilty that they will refrain from using oppression as a medium to rule and exploit us. Okay. So, they will leave it. Okay. They will leave it on their own. We will not force them, or we will not attack them, we will not kill them, we will not have a complete war with them, but this war will be a war with their own internal conscience. Okay, that they are doing something wrong, they should actually correct it. Okay. So, they are doing some, it is like an appeal to the internal conscience of the oppressor, that is the Britishers. Okay, that there is no need to use physical force to fight out the oppressor. He is saying that let's be non-violent, let's not cause any harm. In spite of any harm being caused to us, let's not reciprocate any harm to the, we are human beings first of all. Okay. So, a human being should not be harming any other human being by any physical means, but without resorting to physical means of fighting the Britishers out, we can resort to a means by which using non-violence we can appeal to their conscience so that they themselves would actually leave this country. Okay. That's the basic idea of Satyagraha. So, basic idea, there is no need to use physical force to fight out the oppressor, that is the Britishers. The means, by means of non-violence also we can appeal to the conscience of the oppressor. Okay. So, that's like appealing to the soul and heart of the oppressor that please, this is not something that you should be doing, and this is against humanity. Okay. We are not resorting to violent means to get our rights back, but using non-violence we are making you aware that whatever you are doing is wrong and you should leave this country to the countrymen itself. Okay. So, that was the basic idea of Satyagraha, how it unfolded in India, how it started in India, where and to what extent it caught awareness, and to what extent it united the people of India. This is something that we are going to learn in the next slide. You can take a snapshot of the same. Okay, so now we are going to discuss, in the previous two slides we have seen how Gandhi has emerged in India, okay, and how he came back from South Africa. So, he came back from South Africa in 1915, and his first Satyagraha experiment in India started off in Bihar, in Champaran, in around 1916. So, it took 1 year for him to actually analyze the situation and the various problems that Indians are facing. Okay. So, that's when the Satyagraha. So, what is the Satyagraha philosophy? As we have got a little hint from the previous slide. So, here without adopting violent means, without actually adopting violent means against the oppressor, which might be killing the oppressor, or bombarding the oppressor, or threatening the oppressor. Okay. So, without using the violent means against the oppressor, which here in our case was the Britishers. So, without actually fighting a complete war against them, or without actually using very oppressive means against them, without harming them physically, okay, without, can be persuaded to see the truth. The oppressor can be persuaded to see the truth. The oppressor can be actually enlightened to see the truth. Okay. So, they can be made to realize that what you are doing is actually wrong. This is an appeal to the internal soul of the oppressor. Okay. So, without harming his body, we are appealing to the internal soul of his oppressor, of our oppressor. Persuaded to see the truth by his conscience, he will leave oppression. Why? Because that's how we will win the war. He will leave this entire thing of oppressing his fellow citizens. Okay. So, that's how it was. So, here we have, without being aggressive or revengeful. So without being aggressive or revengeful, Gandhi actually emphasized the policy of Satyagraha so that people can actually gain their independence without harming the Britishers physically. Okay, so the battle for freedom was given a new dimension. Till now we had always fought a battle up front, where we had actually all forms of battles that have been fought in India or in other countries as well were all confronted with arms and ammunition and artillery, but this was a battle of its own kind. Okay, here no arms, without any arms and ammunition and artillery, the purpose was to inspire the oppressors or the imperialistic nations to leave their theory of dominance and be compassionate towards their fellow human beings and leave the feeling of oppression as a whole. Okay, so without being aggressive or without being revengeful, we should be able to attain our freedom. That was the policy of Satyagraha by Gandhiji. Okay, so what were the first experiments, very prime experiments that were performed by Gandhi when he came back to India along his Satyagraha? Okay, the first movement was Peasants Movement in Champaran that happened in 1916. As I said, it took a year for him to analyze the different problems prevailing in different parts of the country, and then he started his battle. So Peasants Movement that happened in Champaran in 1916. Champaran was basically a place in Bihar, and not only in Champaran but in many places the farmers were forced to cultivate indigo. Now indigo was extensively used for dyes and all. Okay, indigo is basically a plantation. So instead of cultivating food crops, the Britishers had told farmers to cultivate indigo, because indigo was something which was extensively used by the industries in Britain. Obviously it was the age of industrialization. Industries were first promoted in England. Okay, so they were forced to cultivate this, and they were given a compensation for the same. Okay, so they were given a compensation on their property taxes and all for the same. So they were forced to cultivate indigo, but what happened is that by and large synthetic dyes started getting manufactured, because of which now the demand for indigos went less. Okay, now the demand for indigos dropped. Now there was a problem. Now they were not getting the compensation, and what happens is indigo cultivation renders the soil useless, or rather barren. Once you cultivate indigo, okay, the soil kind of becomes barren. It is exhausted of the nutrients. So they were not able to cultivate the usual food crops that they were used to cultivating in the previous times, because of which now the farmers were facing a situation of not going back to their original mode of farming and not getting compensation from the Britishers as well. So they were in a dilemma, and that's when Gandhiji came and he resorted to Satyagraha. Now what was the result? Yes, the entire compensation was not paid, but the Britishers paid a part of the compensation. Okay, so there was agitation and there was a protest, but it was a peaceful protest, and somehow it was a little successful. So the first experiment with Satyagraha movement was when the Peasants Movement in Champaran was supported by Gandhi in 1916, and this marks the incident when Gandhi actually made or rather met Dr. Rajendra Prasad, who was the first president of India, and he was a freedom fighter along with Gandhi as well. Okay, so this marks the meeting of these two great personalities who shaped India's freedom. Okay, now that was one thing that was experimented. The second thing that was experimented was Pigeons Movement in Kedar district in Gujarat in 1917. Now what happened in Gujarat was that there was, as I said in the earlier slide, that famines have actually broken in various parts of the country, and Kedar district in Gujarat was also suffering from famines. Now famines is a situation of drought when not enough of water is available for cultivation, so obviously no food crops, but the Britishers at that point of time used to charge taxes. So the peasants were, or the farmers were not able to pay these taxes. They were hardly able to make their ends meet. Where will they kind of gather to pay for taxes? So that's when Pigeons Movement in Kedar district was supported in Gujarat in 1917 by Gandhi. Okay, and that was also under Satyagraha, and this was the time when he met another great personality, that is Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Okay, so two people according to these two movements were met by Gandhiji. He met Dr. Rajendra Prasad in this movement, and he met Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel in this movement. So these three personalities are obviously one of the pioneers in the freedom struggle of India. Okay, so Peasants Movement started in Kedar district, Gujarat in 1917, and Gandhi launched his Satyagraha there as well. Okay, now there was another kind of movement, that was the mill workers movement in Ahmedabad in 1918. Now we need to understand this. These two movements primarily were against the Britishers, because the Britishers were the ones who had actually promised a compensation for the farmers who were growing indigo, and they were not giving it. So the movement was against the Britishers. This was also a movement against the Britishers, because the Britishers were imposing taxes on farmers, and the farmers were actually going through a period of famine or drought without any crop production. So these two movements were definitely against the Britishers. But this third movement was against mill workers, not against mill workers, was for mill workers, and the owners were not Britishers, they were basically Indians. Okay, so these mill workers were basically Indians, and they were not getting their salary, their workers paid their salary and all that stuff. Okay, so there was a situation of epidemic of plague and all. So Gandhi, what he is saying is that Satyagraha was just not for the Britisher as a whole, it was primarily for any kind of oppressor. So here also he launched the Satyagraha movement. This was against the mill owners who were not paying the compensation or salary to the mill workers. Okay, so these three were the initial very starting Satyagraha movements that were launched by Gandhi, and these three were basically fought on a different platform of Satyagraha. Prior to this, it was just killing the oppressor or harming the oppressor. Now the evolution is that without harming the oppressor, we need to appeal to the internal conscience or soul of the oppressor, so that he leaves the very instinct of oppressing others. Okay, so you can take a snapshot of the same.